I'm Matt. I'm a software engineer living in London. It's good to be with you all, at least virtually. Wish I could be there in person. We actually went to Sweden a few years ago in 2020, and yeah, me and my wife loved it. We decided it was the highlight of our year in 2020, which isn't saying a lot for 2020, but we still really enjoyed it while we were there. So a little bits of housekeeping before I start. So the slides, if you're interested, are on my GitHub. My username is just Matt Stobbs, so feel free to find them. I have a blog which I'll mention a few times. It's mattstobbs.com, and if you want to contact me afterwards, if you have any questions or anything like that, the best place is probably Twitter. My handle is Matt_Stobbs. Yeah, so about 6 months ago, I was creating my blog. I built it using a Svelte framework called Elder.js. And as I wrote about later, the hardest part, or at least, yeah, the hardest part I found of making the blog was actually implementing the dark mode, which seemed like it would be a really easy thing to do. And yet it ended up being quite surprisingly tricky. And then 6 months later, Remix is open sourced, and I'm messing around with it. I decided to try and, as I think most developers do who have blogs, try to implement my blog in Remix. And so I started doing that, started trying to figure out how to do dark mode in Remix. Wasn't sure how to do it, and so I went and had a look at how Kenzie Dodds did it in his blog. That's like the gold standard, how that blog's put together. And I found it really interesting, so I ended up writing a blog post about how he implemented dark mode in Remix. And so 2 blog posts on dark mode in 6 months. It's not a lot, but it's kind of weird that it happened twice. Since then, I've also put up a PR in the Remix repo for they've got a examples repo of a bunch of things on how to do certain things in Remix. So I put up a PR on how to do dark mode, which has been accepted. And I've also got 2 more blog posts in my head on dark mode that I'll eventually write when I have the time. So it's something that I spend a weird amount of time thinking about. It's something that I'm pretty familiar with. And so what I wanted to talk about tonight was what is the problem with dark mode? Why is it something that's even worth thinking about? Surely it's relatively straightforward. And then how does a typical UI framework solve this problem? By UI framework, I mean JavaScript frameworks, so Next.js, Gatsby, Elder.js. I assume SvelteKit, although I have less experience with SvelteKit. And then finally, how does Remix solve this problem? Hopefully you all have at least a bit of background knowledge of Remix. It doesn't need to be anything too crazy, but hopefully you've at least heard of Remix, given the title of my talk. If not, you should still be able to follow everything that I'm talking about. Again, if you don't, just shout out. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have as I go along. So what's the problem with Remix? Not Remix. What's the problem with dark mode? Essentially, there are 3 things you need to figure out when you are creating dark mode for an app or a website. You need to figure out how are you going to control which styles to show. How are you going to persist the user's selected preferences? And then how do you show the correct theme before hydration? I call it the flash of doom. And so this is usually how you would implement dark mode. You would have your CSS, you'd have your CSS variables that control all the colors. And then you'd have something like this where if the HTML tag or the body tag has a certain class, you override the variables with new variables. And that will dynamically update everything on the page, and it works pretty well. CSS variables are incredible. But then the question becomes, how do you control that class that's controlling the dark mode? And that's where things start to get tricky for UI frameworks. most UI frameworks, this will be your area of control. There'll be a div that will have an ID of root or an ID of Next.js or whatever. And they'll say inside this div, this is where you do your React. This is where you can control the UI and do everything you do in React. And for 95% of the problems, that's great. It works perfectly. But then as soon as you want to try and do anything outside of that area of control, things typically start to get a bit messy. And so you'll have something like this in your code. This is a toggle for the theme, just be a button, and you'll toggle the theme, and you have to do something like use JavaScript to get the document element and toggle the dark mode. And this works. It's fine, but it feels a bit of a step backwards almost. We kind of left this as we moved on to React. So it's a bit strange to now have to, nowhere else in your React code are you going to have a child element empirically updating the class name of a parent by using a JavaScript selector like this. And it also makes it very hard to, if you have this in multiple places, it's hard to track the dependencies of why is this got the class name it does. It can grow and become a bit of a nightmare to debug. Remix, on the other hand, changes this by giving you full control of the whole HTML. And so this is what it would look like. This is your root component that would be in your, I think they would want us to say root route, but I'm English, and so I call it the root, which is the most irritating thing I have about Remix, but I live with it. And so in your root, you render everything, all of your HTML. If you want it to be in your HTML, you render it here. If you don't put it here, it doesn't get rendered. So you can see even the live reloading that you get with Remix, you have to put that in, otherwise you don't get it. All of your scripts, if you ignore this script tag, your page won't have JavaScript, which I've seen on Twitter quite a lot. People have that problem where, because Remix works very well without JavaScript, often people don't have JavaScript on their page and they don't even realize, and they're wondering why this thing isn't working. And then all of a sudden, usually this isn't the reason, usually it's a different reason, but you have to manually include your scripts. And so with Remix, if we want to give the HTML a class name, we can just give the HTML a class name, and it just works. Which means you can do something like this. So down here is our root component, and up here we're just defining a pretty simple React context. We're going to store our theme and our set theme, and stick it in a provider. And because our root is just a React component, we can actually wrap this in the provider. So we can create a new component down here that would be providers, and we can return this theme provider here. Sorry, it's my phone. The app on the inside. Now our app can access the context from that provider. So we can say, we can get our theme, get it straight from the context, and now we have the theme. We can just put it straight into our as the class name, whether it's light or dark. And it seems like such a small thing, but when I first saw this, especially given all the suffering I'd had to do with dark mode, it just blew my mind, the fact that you could just wrap the whole HTML in a provider, and then take values out of that provider and just pass it in as the class name to the HTML. It just makes so much more sense to me that this is the best way to do it. And yeah, Remix is full of these little details that just make it a joy to work with. So that answers our first problem of how do we control which styles to show. We just wrap it in a provider and let the provider kind of handle everything. But then we have these last two questions, and I'm going to group them together because they're related to each other. So how do you persist the user's selected preference? And then how do you show the correct theme before hydration? So most UI frameworks, you have basically three options to store things locally on the client. You have IndexedDB, session storage, and local storage. IndexedDB is asynchronous, and as we'll see later, we're going to want it to be synchronous. So that rules out IndexedDB. Session storage versus local storage. We'll do a quick Google, which I have to do every single time, and local storage will probably be the best one for us. So somewhere in our application, it could in theory be anywhere, but it will probably be in a layout component or a root component somewhere. We'll have something like this that will be that will have a use effect that when the application starts and mounts, it will grab the initial theme from local storage, and update our HTML tag to have the correct theme. So once again, we're using I guess JavaScript, which as I mentioned before isn't great, but this actually has a worse problem, which is that this use effect is only going to run after the page renders. It's going to render and then it's going to run the use effect, which means if a dark mode user comes to our page, they're going to get blinded by this flash of a white light before the dark mode kicks in. If they're scrolling down on their phone at 2 a.m., they're just going to be blinded in their beds. And so the way to get around this is by using a script tag. So this is HTML that I've just copied straight from my blog. And I've got this script tag in the head. It could either be in the head, it could be at the start of the body. The important thing is that it comes before the content. And the reason why is because script tags are blocking. So as the HTML is being rendered on the page, it's going to hit the script tag and it's going to run everything inside here before it renders everything else. And usually that's a bit of a problem. It's why you usually want script tags after the content, because you want to render the content before you start running all your HTML, before you start running your JavaScript. But in this case, it's a good thing. It's what we want. It's also why we want it to be synchronous, because we want it to block the rendering until we have the initial color preferences. So this code is just checking local storage to see if there's any stored values. If there isn't, it will check the user's preferred color scheme. And if there's none of that either, then it will just use light as a default. So that's how. So then the question becomes, how do you get the script tag into the head or at the start of the body? It's outside of that area of control that we talked about earlier. And most UI frameworks will give you some kind of escape hatch. So in Gatsby, they'll give you this Gatsby SSR file, which has hooks like on render body. So when Gatsby is rendering the body, it will call this hook, and it lets you put components just before the body. So you can insert your script tags that way. Ella.js, which is what I use for my blog, has a similar thing. It has a hooks file that exposes a head stack, which is a stack of all the things that will eventually end up in the head, and you can just push a string that contains your script and it will get rendered in the head. In Remix, however, as you may have guessed, we can just stick that straight into our root. And in fact, because this is just a component, we can create a separate component to kind of isolate our script tag and kind of keep it modular. So here we have a non-flash of wrong else theme else, non-flash of wrong theme else component, and that we can just stick that in the head and it will render our script for us. But in fact, Remix lets us take a step back and ask, do we even need local storage? Is there anything better we can use? Because Remix exposes both the back end and the front end, it actually gives us one more option, which is cookies. So cookies are nice because the backend can read the value. Cookies get sent, just how cookies act. It's not Remix, it's just how cookies act. They get sent with every request to the backend, including the initial request. And so the backend, as it's kind of server rendering the page, can read any user-defined preferences in the cookies and use that to know what the initial theme should be without even having to run any JavaScript. And so this is how it would look. Remix also makes it really easy to use cookies. I'd never used cookies before I started playing with Remix because I thought, oh, that's just too fancy, it's too intense, but Remix makes it like super easy to do. It gives you this create cookie session storage helper function. And you can just define the session storage, define what you want your cookie to be. And if you look on the documentation for the options you can put inside this cookie, the Remix documentation links you to the MDN set cookie docs. So this isn't Remix, this is just web, this is just cookie. And so Remix you kind of accidentally learn web development as you use Remix. So here we're creating our cookie storage, and then this is these are just some helper functions. So a function that will take the request, get the cookie out, and then it will return these helper functions. So get theme, which will get theme from the session, set theme, and commit, and we'll be using those later. So now that we have our this is kind of a map of what we're going to kind of quickly build. So on the back end, we've created this cookie session storage. Now we need a way so that if we jump down here, every time the user updates the theme value, we need to tell the backend you need to update the cookie value. And so the way you would do that in Remix is using actions. And so actions, each route has you can define an action with it. And that action is called basically every time there's a post request. So every time a form is submitted, it's a way of kind of for the front end to talk to the back end, basically. So we can create our route. I've called this one action/set theme. We don't want to actually render anything on this route. So I've also defined this loader. So when the page is this route is loading, it will just redirect you straight back to the home page. This is called a resource route in Remix. It's just a route that's there for a resource, I guess, an action. So what this action is going to do, every time we send a post request to it, it will take the request, it will get the theme session that we created earlier. It will get the new theme value from the request, and then it will update the theme session with the new value and send back a success response that has the new value in the cookie in the header. And so that's how the server is going to update the cookie value. How's the front end gonna I guess activate this action? Gonna send a request to this action. And so if we go back to our theme provider that we made earlier, we want to send a post request every time this theme is updated. And so we can use a use effect. That we want to trigger every time there is a theme value update. And what we want to do inside this use effect, Remix gives us a hook called use fetcher. And it's just a way of, it's usually used for themes, for forms. It's just a way of kind of, sending post requests to the Remix backend essentially. So in our use effect, we can say persist theme dot submit. As I said, this is usually used for forms. So this is like a form is being submitted, it's sending a post request. Inside here, we'll define theme in our body. So this is the new theme value. And down as the second argument, these are the options. So we'll define which action are we sending it to. So this is the name of the route. So that's this here, action/set theme. And our method will be a post request. Now, every time theme updates, this use effect will run, and we'll send a post request to our action set theme. We'll send it the new theme value, and that action will update the cookie. So that's this part down here in the diagram. We've got it so that our backend's created a cookie session storage. And every time the theme value updates, front end is kind of keeping the cookie value up to date. Now we need to do the reason that we've been doing this, which is use that cookie value for our initial render. So if we go back to our root, we can define a loader in here. So as I mentioned before, loaders are just, every root has a loader associated with it. And it's just every time the root loads, this loader is called. And so it's async, pick the request. And in this loader, we want to get the theme session using the function we defined earlier. Then we're going to define a data response. So send back the theme value from the session. Data. And in our function with our providers, we can get that theme from the response. Not from the response. So, and now that we have our theme, we can just pass it into our theme provider. And then inside the theme provider, we can use this theme to set the initial value. And so now we have our initial value in our theme. Everything just will work nicely. The question then becomes, do we still need the script tag? And the answer is yes, if a user is coming to our page that doesn't have a saved preference, they don't already have a cookie value, and we want to use their system preferences. In that case, we will need to run JavaScript still. We'll still need to run the script to find out what their system preferences is. But what Remix lets us do is we can conditionally render this, because if we have a cookie value saved, we don't need to run the script tag because we already know when we're server rendering the page what the preferred theme is. So we can do a similar thing to what we did before. We can get our theme value from the loader data. And we can, for our script component, we can create a new prop. Ask, do we have a server rendered theme? So that'll be true or false, depending on whether we have a theme value. And if we do have a theme when we're server rendering, then we don't need to render this component. And so up here we can use our what did I call it? SSR theme prop. And we can say if we are server rendering the theme, so if the cookie has a specified value, then we can just return null. We don't need the script tag anymore. Someone's just sent a message. What about using the header CH as color schemes? Oh, I didn't know about that. I guess in that case, there might be a header that allows you to get the preferred color scheme. In which case, yeah, as you say, you wouldn't need to use this at all. Cool. I didn't know about that. It's good to know. But yeah, so that is a pretty quick whistle-stop tour of, I guess, what Remix lets you do, how you could implement dark mode using Remix. It gives you full control of your app. It lets you kind of these little, I guess some might think they're hacky, but these solutions that most frameworks struggle with because they're kind of outside of the norm. Remix just makes it so easy to do. And it also makes it incredibly easy to really leverage the platform. It makes it easy to use cookies. And it just uses the web platform and kind of creates an abstraction on top of that. So you kind of accidentally learn web development as you're using Remix. I think it's just really fun to use. If you haven't played with it yet, definitely should check it out. But yeah, that's everything I had to say. Thanks a lot. And I guess are there any other questions?
Thank you. No, I don't think we have any questions. I think that's it. It was really great. Yeah, it was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. It's probably very quick. If you wanted to, I guess, yeah, go through it a bit slower, my blog's probably the best thing to check out. I kind of explain things a bit slower. Yeah, I guess the point of this was just to show that Remix is, yeah, really powerful.
But I think the header he was talking about is the same that you were using in the JavaScript check before you checked it. I think that's the same thing. Like
Okay.
you check the browser default thing.
Okay.
Cool. I think that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out after this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.